Hello everyone, Loremaster of Sotek here, and it's time for the last normal episode of the Chaos Dwarf Q&A. I hope you all are looking forward to us wrapping up all the questions. Like I said, there will be another 2 episodes technically after this one. One of them will feature kind of going over some information that needs some further clarification, such as talking about some parts from the Wulfric novel, and also giving me some time to dive into the Chaos Dwarf elements of the original Man of War game, which will provide a little bit of extra information on some things that I think could use some expanding on. And then the last, so to speak, episode will be a live stream that I'm going to do over on Twitch, where I will just be talking about the Chaos Dwarfs and trying to answer questions from chat that I think cover things we haven't talked about. Though how that's exactly going to play out is debatable, but you know, we'll see what happens with that, and if it turns out to be at least somewhat interesting, then I will of course upload it here on YouTube as well. But without further ado, let's get into the last questions. We're going to be wrapping up the warfare and tactics section, and then we are off to talk about Hashut. So today's first question: who do the Chaos Dwarfs favor fighting the most? How about the least? Who do they fight the most, and who do they fight the least? So this one I think is pretty straightforward, though obviously it's somewhat subjective based on context clues, as we don't have flat straight answers for this. But I would say that the Chaos Dwarfs enjoy fighting the dwarfs the most, as they love nothing more than an opportunity to prove their superiority over those who still worship the ancestor gods. I mean, for them, a chance to slay Dawi or prove that their technology or weapons or forging is superior is something that they will jump at. That is the best thing I think that they can possibly feel in their cruel little hearts. Next, their least favorite opponent is probably the Skaven, as when those two collide, it is nearly always extremely costly for both sides, and if there's one thing the Chaos Dwarves hate, it is a costly battle. It's just a waste of resources, and the Skaven play dirty. I mean, the Chaos Dwarves do everything they can to play dirty and try and gain advantages by unleashing like horribly destructive machines, but the Skaven can actually match them in that field, and the Skaven play way dirtier by the way they utilize, you know, vast numbers, and they tend to have way more machines even if they're less reliable. And then they, of course, are assisted by plagues from Clan Pestilence and monsters from Clan Molder, and all of those various elements to really give them an even more well-rounded army. As for who the most common opponent is, I'd say the Dawi Zhaar probably fight the Greenskins more than anybody else. The Darklands and the surrounding mountains on all sides and the coastline are just heaving with just staggering amounts of orcs and goblins. We're talking at least millions, who are always looking for a fresh fight. And they really don't like the Chaos Dwarfs. The Greenskins seem very aware on almost a racial scale about the fact that the Chaos Dwarfs have exploited them very heavily and use them as slaves very often. And the Greenskins don't seem to take offense to many things, but slavery does seem to be one of the things they will take offense to. They are a very wild people that like to be able to just do as they please. And I think for them, the concept of being enslaved is particularly irritating. Not that they really care, I think, about their fellows, but I think to them just the idea of the Chaos Dwarfs lording over them bothers them significantly. So they attack Zarnagrund and the outposts of the Chaos Dwarfs on a very, very, very regular basis. And then the race that they have fought the least, I think it would have to be the Lizardmen. as the children of the old ones do not have a navy, at least not that I've ever heard of, and the Dawi Zhaar only tend to go far abroad when they're searching for large populations of slaves to capture, which means they're not exploring hostile jungles in the Southlands or Lestria. Why would they go there? The only thing they could get of value would be like, you know, ancient technology or magical trinkets, because they already have plenty of mineral wealth. They don't need gold and stuff. And the Chaos Dwarfs probably aren't even entirely sure like what the Lizardmen are, or how advanced they are, or how real they are. They just don't encounter them that often. The closest things the Chaos Dwarfs will have averagely seen to Lizardmen are the creatures in the Dragon Isles, which are not true Lizardmen anymore. They are a species that has kind of degenerated back into being wild animals. So if you were to go to the Dragon Isles, you would encounter like ancient ruins of the Lizardmen, but all of the Saurus, Kroxigors, and Skinks that you would encounter would be a much more primal, debased version that isn't like, they're not higher there's no society, they're just wild animals. Because they kind of just broke down over thousands of years without any of the Slawn around, and something must have gone wrong with their spawning pools, but there doesn't seem to be like normal Lizardmen anywhere near the Darklands. So the Chaos Dwarfs just probably don't run into them, ever. And the Lizardmen don't really have a reason to interact with the Chaos Dwarfs. The Lizardmen will go out globally to fight global threats, you know, to try and tip the Great Plan back into balance. But for them, the Chaos Dwarfs are probably a less easy to detect threat, because the Chaos Dwarfs move so slowly. Like, they're not constantly expanding or trying to set up doomsday devices or leading massive charges to upset the balance of the world, or constantly tracking down and toppling Menhir stones or Ogham stones or any of those nexus points in the geometric web. They're just not concerned with those kinds of things. So I just don't see those two encountering each other that often. Next is questions regarding, which I'm just going to really simplify this because we've answered this so many times in so many different ways, but a lot of people, this is probably one of the most asked questions, breaks down to everything dwarfs versus Chaos Dwarfs. And a lot of these we've answered, I think, massively. We've talked about if they had like a full-on race versus race showdown. We've talked about their empires. We've talked about their cultural differences, their similarities, their physical differences, their physical similarities. We've talked about, like, you know, so much stuff. The only ones that I've kind of like summed into this that I'm going to answer separate are that if you were to put, say, like the legendary Lord squads against each other, which is kind of a weirdly specific question, but let's say we broke it down to 4 guys per team, right? So the dwarfs, let's say they get Thoric Ironbrow, Thorgrim Grudgebearer, Ungrim Iron Fist, and Belagar Ironhammer, and then the Chaos Dwarfs get Gorda's Backstabber, Astragoth Ironhand, Drazwath the Ashen, and Shartor the Executioner. I think the dwarfs would just utterly curb stomp the Chaos Dwarfs, to be honest with you. While I like the Chaos Dwarfs do bring sorcery to the ballpark, as long as Thoric's there, Thoric is more than enough of a challenge to go up toe-to-toe with the likes of Astragoth Ironhand and Drazwath the Ashen, especially if he has his Anvil of Doom. He would be more than a magical match for the two of them, because he just specializes so much in shutting down magic. And, I mean, the Throne of Power alone, I don't know how the Chaos Dwarfs would stop it. I mean, Gorda's Backstabber would be functionally useless, I think, in that matchup. Maybe he'd be able to pull off some sneaky shenanigans, but when you have someone like Belagar Ironhammer on the field, someone who's used to fighting the likes of Skarsnik, I think Backstabber would be a joke in comparison. Maybe slightly more of a physical opponent, but, you know, Gobla is obviously a meaner opponent, but, like, Gorda's Backstabber, for all of his nastiness, is nothing compared to Skarsnik's trickery. And then if you have, like, the Throne of Power alone, the only two I think that could threaten Thorgrim on the Throne of Power would be the Drasweth the Ashen on his Bale Taurus Cinder Breath, or Astragoth if his suit is truly that powerful. But you're going up against true relics of the Ancestor Gods, and I just don't think Hashut can compete with that level of power. Not in a straight one-on-one fight. I think, honestly, when it comes to, like, champions versus champions, the dwarves tend to come out very far ahead. I think the Chaos Dwarfs have a better situation when it's, like, full armies versus each other. Like, if you have two balanced armies fighting one another, I actually think the Chaos Dwarfs have the advantage most of the time, because they have a lot more versatility. You know, they have fast cavalry, they have flying monsters, they have significant cannon fodder with hobgoblins, and the dwarfs would really struggle to equalize out that situation. But I think when it comes to, like, champions versus each other, no, I think the dwarfs would curb stomp them every single time. I literally do not... I don't think there's a single Chaos Dwarf character who could go up against Thorgrim Grudgebearer on the Throne of Power and win. I think they would always lose. His allotment of magical items... I mean, Thorgrim on the Throne of Power is one of the most terrifyingly tanky and nasty characters in the entirety of Warhammer Fantasy. He is a huge deal to fight. Especially because you're dealing with a character that is so horrendously tanky that it takes something monstrously powerful to harm him. And he has an Axe of Grimnir as his melee weapon, which is an axe that is specifically designed to kill monstrous things. So there are just very, very few characters that would be able to really go toe-to-toe with him. And I think the only one that would stand a remote chance would be Astragoth. But that would purely come down to how his suit is designed and how it functions, which isn't something we have a lot of details about. Astragoth is a well-known character who's very not well explored, if that makes sense. Like, he did have playable rules if you go far enough back, but as to how, like, his suit would translate into the modern lore, I just don't feel confident to say that he would really be able to go toe-to-toe with something like Thorgrim. I don't see them winning. As far as the other questions, one was, how would Chaos Dwarfs react to a dwarf that fell to Chaos? Isn't really a strategy question, but we'll go ahead and answer it here. I think the Chaos Dwarfs would be willing to deal with a dwarf that fell to Chaos. I think it's vaguely insinuated. I'd have to go back and reread every little thing I could find on it. But in the Dreadfleet expansion, there is a dwarf who fell to Chaos, not a true Chaos Dwarf, being the Lord of the Black Kraken, its commander. And I believe he has dealt with the Chaos Dwarfs in his history. So there does seem to be a precedent for them being at least willing to deal with such an individual. They seem to save their ire for Dawi that are still loyal to the Ancestor Gods. Because it's honestly the Ancestor Gods that they are upset with. Like, the Chaos Dwarves despise their fellow kin as being weak and all this stuff, but I think for them, they hate their kin as an extension of the Ancestor Gods. I think if the Ancestor Gods were kind of... If you're dealing with a dwarf who's gone rogue somehow, I don't think they care nearly as much. And, yeah, I think that pretty much answers all of those questions of, you know, what does... You know, there's another one here that's like, if they sent out their greatest champion one-on-one to fight, the dwarves would easily take that. Easily. The Chaos Dwarfs do not have anybody that could, I think, one-on-one Gotrek Gurnison or Thorgrim Grudgebearer. I think they'd even struggle with the likes of Ungrim Ironfist or Belagar Ironhammer. Like, they could probably maybe win those fights, but the dwarves are one of the best races when it comes to singular champions. The Dawi have a very good history when it comes to winning challenges, even against some of the most skilled and powerful members of other races. It's just something they specialize in. Moving on. What are all the roles in the Chaos Dwarf military for Hobgoblins? We've been over this, but basically, Hobgoblins are only trusted to be cannon fodder and scouts. roles where if they break and flee or get completely slaughtered, then it doesn't really impact the Chaos Dwarf's strategy or tactics at all. They're just incredibly craven creatures, and the Chaos Dwarfs know way better than anyone to not trust them with anything important. I mean, the infantry are... Hobgoblins are so craven that it's pretty much noted that they would almost assuredly flee from the battlefields on a much more regular basis if it weren't for the fact that they are more scared of the Chaos Dwarfs than they are of their enemies. And the Chaos Dwarfs work very hard to cultivate that image. They want the Hobgoblins to be terrified of them, so that when they're marching into battle, they know they're going to keep moving forward because, you know, if they turn around and try and run, the Chaos Dwarfs are going to cut them down without even giving a damn. Or running them over. Like, Chaos Dwarfs do not care. Their Hobgoblins are expendable, and they are only useful to, you know, be a speed bump or an annoyance. That being said, Hobgoblin Wolf Riders are a little bit different because they're more like mercenaries, even though they're not treated particularly well. The Chaos Dwarfs can get usefulness out of them because if there's one thing you can rely on Hobgoblins for, besides being craven backstabbers, is that if they see an incredibly exposed flank or light troop, they will go after it. Hobgoblins are very malevolent, malicious creatures, just like most goblins, and if they see something weaker than themselves, or they perceive it to be weaker than themselves, they will attack it. Because to them, that's just a good bit of fun. So, if you had Hobgoblin Wolf Rider scouts running around the battlefield, and they saw like a unit of Empire crossbowmen, or some exposed, you know, elven archers or something, or war machine crews, they would absolutely veer and just come plowing in at incredible speeds to just start tearing things up. So you can't rely on them for that, and that's one of their most useful battlefield roles. And both can be fielded with arrows, so, you know, they're very inaccurate, relatively speaking, but they tend to be fielded in large numbers, so, you know, if you have enough guys with bows, some arrows are going to hit, and it'll just cause some peppering damage. Next question. You've mentioned before that the Hellcannons are supposed to be terrifying melee combatants. How do these weapons defend themselves in the lore? We've talked about this in the past, I believe, so once again, being brief. Hellcannons contain such immensely powerful demons that they're able to manipulate their physical forms. So, like, those giant jaws around the barrel of the cannon, those aren't just there for ornamentation. The demon inside the Hellcannon can actually manipulate the physicality of the cannon to, like, lean itself forward, or, like, snap the barrel down and actually snap those jaws closed on people. And rip them apart, or charge into an enemy monster and tear out big chunks of flesh. Most notably, though, probably the deadliest thing they do that happens a lot is the chains. So the Chaos Dwarfs attach a lot of metal chains to these Hellcannons, and then they spike them into the ground, which the goal is to keep the Hellcannon stationary so it doesn't charge off to attack people. It's not actually because of the recoil, which is why you would do it on most war machines. Because a Hellcannon will just charge into battle and use those huge spiked wheels to run over people and its jaws and just its sheer mass. But it can also animate those chains as almost like tentacles. So the chains go lashing around at great speeds. And I don't know if you've ever seen images or videos of what a chain can do. Like just a nice solid thick chain of steel or iron. When it comes slinging around, those things have horrific amounts of force behind them. And can easily, like, shatter concrete or, like, just literally blow a person into bits because the force is just so tremendous. I mean, the chains that are used on a Hellcannon are so large. These are the kind of chains that if you were to hold it and run down the street and then run back so that, like, the chain follows you and then it, you know, turns abruptly when it gets to the part where you started running back, that part where it turns back, even though it looks like it's moving super slow, it would be a huge amount of force, and it can sound like a gun going off because that snap just has so much like potential energy built up in it. Their chains are spooky, especially when they're moving really, really quick. And a Hellcannon uses that to excellent effectiveness. And then the last question for this section, how do the Infernal Guard compare to other elite infantry? So essentially, they are one of the highest tier melee infantry out there. thanks to their black shard armor, which is incredibly heavy, and having the ability to wield fire glaives, which fire glaives are not only terrifyingly efficient halberds that are like really strong and are made of these, like, you know, they've got like runic augments so they can pierce armor and all this stuff, but they're also rifles. They are also incredibly accurate long-range rifles that can do devastating firepower. So, I mean, even without including the range component these guys bring to the table, they can easily go toe-to-toe with the mightiest of heavy infantry like Swordmasters, Chosen, and Temple Guard. So I would easily classify Infernal Guard as S tier. I genuinely believe that they are one of the strongest melee infantry groups in the setting. Or, you know, they're at least up there. And now it is time to talk about Hashut. And we're just going to go right in with the biggest, baddest question that I think was the most asked question in the entire Q&A. What is Hashut? And what is he all about? So a lot of these questions, there are a lot of questions included in this, but I'm just going to kind of like talk through Hashut, and it should answer pretty much everyone's questions. So Hashut, as we know for sure, is the Chaos Dwarf's god, and he is the god of tyranny, greed, fire, and hatred. He is most often represented as a great blazing bull who is forever wreathed in smoke and shadow, a being noted for having a very grim and malignant nature. Also known as the Father of Darkness, as he's often called, he is a deal maker who offers incredible power but at a terrible cost. While like most gods, he desires and feeds upon devotion and prayer, Hashut is a little bit notable in that he greedily demands flesh and blood in copious amounts to satiate his deep hunger. He requires very specifically physical sacrifice, not just worship. When it comes to what he actually is, that's really difficult to answer. Hashut is one of the most mysterious entities in Warhammer Fantasy, as he is worshipped by one of the least explored races, and the lore around him is very intentionally nebulous. There are three primary theories, though, about the true nature of Hashut, those being that number one, he's a traditional god, number two, he's actually an archdemon from the realm of chaos, or number three, he's something else entirely. Personally, I find the first theory to be the least likely, that Hashut is a normal god who formed from the floating emotions or notable concepts of sentient creatures manifesting within the ether, or the realm of chaos as it's more commonly known. This is actually how the vast majority of the Warhammer Fantasy gods come into existence. But Hashut does not fit this mold very well, as his main spheres of greed and tyranny aren't really core emotions that existed in a large scope during the ancient times where Hashut would have needed to come around. Plus, the most notable thing about Hashut is that he seemed to have been literally found, as in like physically discovered, by the Dawi Zhaar in the deepest darkness beneath the earth. And based on how terrified the Chaos Dwarfs are of the deep dark beneath Uzkalak to this day, I would personally wager that Hashut, or whatever Hashut really is still down there. Or at least his physical form, or a notable portion of his power. So, what about the Archdemon theory? Well, this is certainly possible. Hashut could well just be an incredibly powerful greater demon of one of the dark gods. And he does share a lot of overlaps with Khorne and Slaanesh, respectively. When it comes to Khorne, Hashut is a damn angry god. And by the words and teachings of the Chaos Dwarfs, he is believed to be a god of hatred, which is literally on the big bad red man's doorstep. not to mention the fiery demon engines and living mechanical horrors, is also something used as a major component of Khorne's own personal legions. The Blood God is also often considered to be the closest thing to a god of smiths by the reckoning of those who serve the four greater powers. On the other hand, greed is one of the two major spheres of Hashut's influence, and probably one of the most important things for him in particular, and that particular sin falls deeply under the influence of Slaanesh. The Prince of Excess is also the one most favored by tyrants, for arrogance and pride are the finest of wines to the Dark Prince. I would heavily argue that between the four greater powers, greed and tyranny are heavily underneath Slaanesh's domain. Finally, the animal that Slaanesh seems to most favor is actually the bull, which is why the Keepers of Secrets, which are the greater demons of Slaanesh, have bovine features. Bit of a strange coincidence there, isn't it? This theory of being an archdemon would also explain how Hashut knows so much about the nature of demons and how to bind them. He taught the dwarves of Zorn-Uzkul powerful sorceries and many secrets about the nature of magic, so that they could fuse it with their knowledge of crafting and industry to create truly abominable things. The only major hiccup in this theory is that if Hashut is merely a fragment from one of the other dark gods, or maybe even just a powerful demon from the realm of chaos itself, who's more, maybe he did form from greed, and he's more of like a neutral force, so he's not like a greater demon split off of one of the major four powers, but kind of his own entity in the same sphere, because there are many demons who you could classify as undivided. You know, big bad scary demons who do not serve any of the four greater powers, but are just large enough spheres of influence within the realm of chaos that they have become sentient and they wield notable powers in and of themselves. However, if Hashut falls under any of those situations, then how did he manage to meet the Chaos Dwarfs in the first place, before anyone else, any of the other demons or creatures that like to make bad deals? And how did he manage to build up and develop his own major religion in opposition to the other powers without being noticed or punished, in particular if he is a greater demon? Perhaps his father deity just approves of Hashut's dealings, or maybe as the god of tyranny, he formed as an archdemon and was just kind of his own thing and managed to somehow slip underneath the notice of the big major powers because they're always too busy involved with each other in their great game. From there, perhaps when the Great Cataclysm was going off, it could be that Hashut slipped free of the ether during the Great Cataclysm, and since he wasn't like a titanic god, he was able to manifest himself physically in the physical plane, and he saw the writing on the wall that, you know, the time of demons was coming to an end, and so he buried himself deep within the chaos-tainted soil of Zorn-Uzkul to await an opportunity, as many powerful demons have in fact hid their physical forms deep within the darkest pits of the earth, where they can actually find natural wells of magic to maintain their physical forms and avoid being cast back into the realm of chaos, at least until they're discovered and slain. This is why there are many myths and flat-out stories about when the dwarfs or the Skaven or anybody delves too deep, there's actually a pretty half-decent chance you can find demons down there, which you have to be careful about. The theory I personally, though, find the most compelling is that Hashut is none of these things, but something else entirely. Something foul and terrible that clawed its way into the world during the reality-shattering explosion that started off the Great Cataclysm. That sundering of space and time that violated the very fabric of the universe itself, and it's undeniable for us that paths to many realities tore open, even if only for a fraction of a second. It's entirely possible that the Father of Darkness was set loose upon the Warhammer world during that apocalyptic event, cascading down upon the earth like a fiery meteor and slamming into what would become Xur-Nu-Skul. Here he dug deep into the earth and waited patiently in the darkness, studying the fundamental laws of the deepest realms and learning to master them with his own power. When the Chaos Dwarfs stumbled upon Hashut, they found a horrifying monstrosity in the shape of something akin to a titanic bull, wreathed in flame and shadow, that heard their pleas for deliverance and offered them a bargain. If they would feed his desire for sacrifice and subjugation of this world, then he would give to them all of his terrible knowledge. So, a pact was formed, and the Father of Darkness taught them strange but potent powers. He taught them the fundamental laws of the Ether, showing how they could twist their ancestral runic lore to bind demons into artifacts and machines, just as how the ancestor gods had once shown the dwarves how to bind the raw winds of magic into runes of power. He taught them the secrets of the planet itself, lore that would allow the Chaos Dwarf sorcerers to summon and command the magma of the deep earth itself, and how to manipulate buried earthly elements like obsidian. He began to work a great change upon them, utilizing the abundant power of chaos to alter the dwarfs on a fundamental level, and make them into something more befitting of his image. Instead of being a demon or god that requires magic to exist, and is merely a reflection of sentient emotions run wild, Hashut could well be a true entity, a physical terror that requires nothing to exist and lurks to this day deep beneath Uzkalak, while the worship of the Chaos Dwarfs has allowed him to breach into the ether itself, where he ascends steadily in his desire to subjugate all realities beneath his tyranny. For all things merely exist to serve the cruel desires of Hashut. Ultimately, all of the above theories are valid, and it just comes down to your personal interpretation. Perhaps if he reappears in Age of Sigmar, we will learn more about the truth behind Hashut, but at the end of the day, what's for certain is that he is the god of the Dawi Zhaar, and is a cruel lord who represents the concepts of tyranny and greed to an impressive degree. And for anyone that may be a little bit confused, I just want to add an additional note that gods in the Warhammer world don't necessarily have to start off as emotions or concepts. If you have like an animal or a person or a thing that you start to worship, and there's like a genuine deep worship there, and enough people are worshiping it and making sacrifices to it and all this stuff, it can essentially ascend to godhood. It can either that understanding of it or the entity itself can sort of ascend to be able to become aware and start to manifest and manipulate the ether. That's what happened to Sigmar. Sigmar is a human that enough people worshipped that, and he had like such a major religion built around him that he literally ascended into godhood from being just a man. Or at least something very close to a man. We'll talk about that another time. But let's continue on with Hashut. As for if Hashut has any demons, no. Hashut has never been recorded as having his own demonic servants, which in my opinion lends further credence to the theory of him being some alien monstrosity from another plane of existence. The closest thing to demons for Hashut are probably the Great Taurus, those winged bulls, which are apparently the spitting image of Hashut according to the Chaos Dwarfs, and some of them believe the creatures to be manifestations of Hashut's will, or maybe just elementals of the Darklands themselves. A theory that I've developed is that the Taurus actually predate Hashut, being natural creatures that have haunted the Darklands before the hold of Uzkalak was even founded. Perhaps when the Father of Darkness manifested his way into reality and arrived in the Darklands, he saw one of these monstrous bulls and found the creature to be a kindred spirit, therefore taking on its form for himself. Regardless, they definitely have some kind of connection to Hashut, though they definitely are not demons, as they are 100% living creatures made of flesh and blood, along with concerning amounts of fire, that leave behind actual corpses when killed. So 100% not demons, even though they are magical in nature. As for the questions about fear and despair, because there was someone who asked, like, how is Hashut the god of tyranny? Shouldn't he be god of fear? Because a lot of people who, like, have encounters with tyranny are experiencing fear, yada yada. So to answer this particular issue, the thing about tyranny is that one of the best ways to enforce tyranny is by inflicting fear and despair on people to remind them who's boss. But Hashut doesn't really care how people are subjugated, so long as they are. When his direct powers are invoked, Hashut's only notable impact on the psychology of his victims is to brutally crush their will to resist or stand against him, not to send them running in fear and terror. I think you may be drawing connections that are often secondary to more significant ones. If Hashut was even drawn to the dwarfs of Zorn-Uzkul during their first encounter, it was by their greed, not by their fear. It was the greed of the dwarfs that led them to settle Zorn-Uzkul when all of their kin rightfully turned back. It was greed that led them to dig deeper and wait for unrealistic reinforcements instead of fleeing to safely when the impending doom approaching became more clear. It was greed that led the dwarfs to make error after error until suddenly they found themselves up against a brick wall with nowhere to turn, and then found an entity of that same sin waiting with a bargain in the deepest dark. While you could argue that fear is a fundamental aspect of tyranny, I would argue back that while everything Hashut does feeds into his desire for domination, not everything he does exists to elicit fear from sentient creatures. All of the dark gods cause immense terror in those who serve them and those who fight against them, but none of them are considered to have fear as their major spheres of influence, because it's just simply something they all have in common. Evil, violent, and cruel things are scary, but that's a byproduct of their nastiness, not the end-all be-all. I would not say Hashut is any more less or more scary than Khorne, Tzeentch, Nurgle, or Slaanesh. And Hashut certainly doesn't desire despair in his victims. He wants you to work, to be useful. If you're going to fall into the despondency caused by despair, then Papa Nurgle is happy to take you in. But to Hashut, you're utterly useless, except as a resource. He doesn't care how you feel about being subjugated, only that you are subjugated. Most of us would probably despair at being enslaved by the Chaos Dwarfs, but some would be filled with rage, or terror, or any number of complex emotions. But once again, these are all meaningless byproducts of the actual point, which is to be enslaved. Hopefully, that clears up that kind of misconception. Alright, moving on. What role did Hashut play in the end times along with the Chaos Dwarfs? So, as we've discussed, the Chaos Dwarfs were utterly annihilated during the end times, according to a singular passage describing the event, which essentially details that Mengozar Nagrund was put under siege by Grimgor Ironhide's Beast Wa, and finally met its doom when the infamous ogre mercenary Golgthag Maneater managed to somehow get inside the fortress and open the main gates from within. With the army then bolstered by the unstoppable magic of the prophet Wurzag due to the sheer amount of Wa energy, even Hashut could not stem the tide. Powerful as the god of tyranny is, he stood no chance against the unified powers of Gork and Mork at the height of their strength during the end times. Even the Dark Brothers, being the Big Four, they feared the combined might of Gork and Mork, but Hashut alone could not stand before them any more than the mightiest dwarf-built wall could stand before a titanic earthquake or a raging apocalyptic flood. Gork and Mork are primal forces of destruction, a power practically designed on a fundamental level to tear down all that Hashut sought to build. As for the god himself, Hashut did not make any appearances during the end times in the actual text, though his influence in the Warhammer fantasy world was likely torn down alongside the Temple of Hashut itself. Moving on. How is the relationship between Hashut and the Dawi Zhaar? How are the Chaos Dwarfs bound to him, and do they ever try to sever this contract? The Dawi Zhaar deeply revere and admire all that is Hashut, or at least they seem to. They are still dwarfs in very fundamental ways, and one of those is that they take their oaths just as seriously as the Dawi of the World's Edge Mountains. When their ancestors made that terrible bargain of offering up their souls and service to Hashut in exchange for his power, that was a promise bound in blood and stone. The kind of oath that no dwarf would ever even consider breaking, especially as Hashut has continued to hold up his end of the bargain and kind of change the dwarves to being more like him. There has never been any Chaos Dwarf who has attempted to sever this contract, and any attempt to do so would likely result in horrific consequences. As the Dawi Zhaar and Hashut are now so deeply entwined, it would be really difficult to determine where the dwarf ends and the influence of Hashut begins. I would argue that they're kind of like lesser demons of his. They're so deeply intertwined. Moving on. What is the relationship between Hashut and the Dark Gods, including the Horned Rat? Hashut is a greedy, selfish, tyrannical beast of a god. He has zero interest in entertaining alliances or even pleasantries with the other Chaos Gods, and seeks only to grind them beneath his iron hooves. While the Great Horned Rat desires ultimate power for himself, that creature is cowardly and duplicitous, like his children, and will play at politics and scheming to worm his way onto the Great Pantheon. Hashut is far too prideful for such schemes. He loathes each of the Dark Gods as weak and insignificant insects to be squashed underfoot as soon as the opportunity presents itself. I don't think he would even accept a place on the Pantheon if they offered it to him. For now, the Dark Gods are merely tools. Their servants and demons fit as fodder with which to power Hashut's own designs for domination and destruction. His hatred for the other Dark Gods is probably only topped by his ire for his ultimate rivals, the ancestor gods of the dwarfs. Next question. How does Hashut as a deity compare to other more minor gods such as Sotek, the Great Horned Rat, etc.? Hashut occupies the same level of power as the other minor powers found across the world. He's a staggering force in and of himself, though Hashut operates by a much different rule set than any other god when it comes to his worship. Hashut is patient. He does not mind that the Chaos Dwarfs are taking their time so long as they continue to further his glory by unleashing devastation in his name. The act of crafting a terrifying demon engine or magical trinket and granting it to some warrior of chaos or whatever is considered an act of worship in Hashut's name, as the creation in question will go on to cause suffering and death. This feeds Hashut's gluttonous hunger, despite the wielder of that trinket or weapon or whatever virtually always worshipping their own god and having no interest in the Lord of Tyrants. The Dawi Zhaar keep him further fed with a steady stream of sacrifices, which is quite in line with other gods that have to be intentionally empowered, such as Sotek. But in regards to strength, he is definitely in the higher tier of gods playing just beneath the Dark Brothers, scheming his own little ways of how to overtake these supposedly greater powers. Moving on. Does Hashut have any non-dwarf worshippers? Does he have influence over anyone besides the Chaos Dwarfs? No and no. Hashut, to my understanding, is only known to the Chaos Dwarfs in any meaningful capacity, and they seem to very jealously guard this knowledge. I'm sure Hashut would be more than happy to take on worshippers from other races, but the price for his knowledge and blessings is incredibly steep. And I doubt that non-dwarfs would have a very high chance of surviving such an exchange. You could heavily argue that the Chaos Dwarfs' constitution and tenacity, being dwarfs, actually gave them the ability to survive the gifts of Hashut. And then the last question, the final question written for this Q&A. Was Hashut destroyed during the end times? I really doubt it. Being one of the Chaos Gods by all accounts, he likely survived in some fashion, and is skulking around somewhere in Age of Sigmar. It has been entirely confirmed 100% that the Chaos Dwarfs are still around and active, so perhaps he saved some of his worshippers from the end times, similar to how the other Chaos Gods did, such as the Horned Rat scooping up Skavenblight. Or maybe he took a massive blow from Grimgor's Beastwa raising Mingolzar Nagrund, and he took a good long while to restore himself and is only now starting to come back to power, if it's even him. As we've spoken about before in the Age of Sigmar section, we know that there is some evil power that managed to destroy the Dwarf Pantheon in Age of Sigmar before the Dark Gods even got there. So it could be that Hashut maybe wormed his way into the Dwarf Pantheon, or found some way to subtly influence the Dwarfs in Age of Sigmar, and they were able to restore him to power. But we don't know yet. As I said earlier, while I personally do not believe that Hashut started as a Chaos God and was something other, I do believe that by the end of Warhammer Fantasy, he was a true Chaos God, and that all of that worship and sacrifice did allow him to worm his way into the ether and manifest as a true god. But whether or not he survived the end times and is still kicking around in AOS and is about to make his triumphant return, who knows? Maybe it'll be Hashut, maybe it'll be some new god that was on the Dwarf Pantheon and something happened to him. It's impossible to say. But seeing as the Chaos Dwarfs are still around, and they're still being all nasty and stuff, I personally believe that Hashut is kind of bound to them, and that he is still around, and during 3rd edition for Age of Sigmar, he will be coming out of the shadows once again. So thank you all so much for watching. This episode was a little longer, but I didn't feel like splitting into 2 episodes. So I hope you enjoyed it. Like I said, I'll be back again soon to kind of answer some follow-up questions, and then we'll do a live stream to really wrap it up. And that's it. We're done. So thank you all very, very much for submitting your questions. I hope you enjoyed yourselves. I hope you learned a lot. And I hope you are really big fans, or at least excited to see the Chaos Dwarfs, whether you want to join alongside them or beat them into the dirt. So thank you all again very, very much for joining me. I'm going to go ahead and call it for this episode, and I'll see you guys next time for some wrap-up discussions, and then of course for the next live stream, which on that episode, the next episode, I will announce the date and time of the live stream so that you can make it, and maybe we'll even do something kind of cool there, who knows. So thank you all so much for watching, and I'll see you next time. Bye.